Listen carefully, because the next breath you take will not be the same as the last. In the darkness before dawn, when the Texas wind still carried secrets instead of dust, a sound rose from the Pedernals River basin, a low, trembling cry that was never meant to reach another human ear. The kind of sound a man makes only when he realizes the truth has finally slipped its chains. You were not supposed to hear it. No one was. But now that you have, you've already stepped beyond the line that guards the forbidden. You're here because something inside you wants the truth, not the version written in courthouse ledgers or whispered in half-dead town histories. You want the kind of truth that rearranges a man, the kind that marks him, the kind the old powers buried in dust and scripture and silence. So I'll give you what they tried to erase. Texas, 1854. A year that should have been forgotten. A homestead that should never have been found. And a father whose name should have stayed sealed beneath ash. But history doesn't forget. It just waits for someone willing to listen. Picture the hill country then, not the polished legend they sell in museums, but the real thing, a sprawl of cedar and ravine carved by storms and gun smoke. Land so empty that even God seemed to keep his distance. And there, in that void, stood a ranch hidden behind oak thickets and a father's iron will. The Hargrove homestead, 800 acres of silence, a place where no laughter, no music, no women's voices ever drifted beyond the porch. Only the sermons of a man who believed isolation was the purest form of power. 7 daughters, 7 pregnancies, one man guarding the truth like scripture carved in bone. You've heard fragments of this story, distorted, sanitized, softened until the horror loses its shape. But the truth is sharper, it cuts, and it begins with a single moment. A traveling physician stepping onto a porch that felt colder than the winter behind him. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the last man who would ever see the Hargrove daughters before the world swallowed the names. He thought he was there to save lives. He had no idea he was walking into a place where the concept of family had rotted into something unrecognizable. And you, now that you've stepped across this threshold, are going with him. Before you follow me deeper, steady your breath. Men who rush into darkness don't return with truth, they return with nightmares. And what we're uncovering here is not a tale, not folklore, not the campfire version of frontier evil. This is the anatomy of control, the architecture of isolation, the blueprint of how a single man can bend an entire world around his will when no one is watching. Dr. Hayes knew none of that as he approached the Hargrove ranch on that first day. He rode under a sky the color of dried blood, the sun sinking behind him like a dying lantern. For miles there had been no birds, no cattle, no sign of life, just the oppressive quiet that blankets land shaped by fear instead of seasons. Hayes later wrote that the silence felt constructed, as if every sound had been scrubbed away by deliberate hands. Men trained in human behavior often say you can sense a controlled environment even before you see it. Hayes sensed it long before the ranch house came into view. The property emerged slowly, like a secret deciding whether to reveal itself. A limestone house, too large for the land, too clean for frontier living. Windows shuttered though the day was warm. Doors closed though the air stank of confinement. Not a single footprint in the dust except Josiah's. It was not a home. It was a kingdom of one. Josiah met the doctor at the threshold. Tall, rigid, eyes sharp enough to scan a man's soul in a single glance. He spoke without greeting, without warmth, without even the polite coarseness of Texas men. His first words were not instructions, they were a warning. You've taken an oath, doctor, he murmured, and oaths are binding before God. A statement, not a reminder. A command cloaked in piety. Hayes stepped inside. Darkness swallowed him. The shutters strangled the daylight into thin slivers, painting the interior in narrow stripes of gold and shadow. The air was too still, as if even the walls were afraid to breathe. Then Hayes noticed something else, an emptiness, not of objects, but of sound. No footsteps, no murmurs, no movement upstairs, only Josiah's breathing, steady, controlled, rehearsed. It felt like walking into a mind, not a house. And that's when Dr. Hayes understood, though he couldn't yet name it, that he was entering the domain of a man who had built his own reality, and forced everyone under his roof to live inside it. Up the staircase, the air grew heavier, as if each step carried Hayes deeper into a pressure system he couldn't see but could feel sinking into his bones. A physician knows the difference between a home filled with sick people and a home filled with fear. This was the latter. Fear has a scent, a texture, a rhythm, and in that house, it clung to the walls like damp mold. Josiah didn't walk, he guided, one hand behind his back, the other brushing the railing only when necessary, like a man accustomed to moving through darkness without needing his eyes. Hayes followed, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. Later he would write that the house felt, designed to be walked in silence, as though noise itself would violate some unspoken law. At the top of the stairs, Josiah paused in front of a door. A door too thick for a ranch house. Too polished, too carefully maintained. Doors like that didn't keep out weather, they kept in secrets. Josiah opened it without ceremony. 7 beds, 7 young women, 7 pairs of eyes trained downward as if obedience were the only language they knew. For a moment, Hayes forgot how to breathe. He scanned the room slowly, forcing himself into professional detachment. But professionalism crumbled under the weight of what he saw. The daughters were arranged in perfect symmetry, beds aligned like cots in a barracks. Their hair neatly braided, their hands folded. Not one spoke, not one shifted, not one acknowledged the doctor until Josiah permitted it with a single nod. Hayes approached the eldest first. Ruth, 28, her expression calm, but her eyes carrying the hollow sheen of someone who had lived too long under command. When Hayes asked a question, she answered quietly, mechanically, as if reading from a script carved into her memory. The others followed the same pattern. Naomi, Judith, Esther, Deborah, Mary, Sarah, the youngest, barely 15, her voice so faint it seemed borrowed from someone else's throat. Her shoulders trembled, but her words remained obedient. Trained. This was not natural submission. This was indoctrination. And yet, none of the women acted confused about their condition. No shock, no shame, no whispered pleas for help. They carried their pregnancies with the resigned acceptance of people who had long ago learned that resistance had no place in their world. Hayes finished the final examination with a sensation that felt less like completing a medical task and more like crossing a threshold he could never step back from. When Josiah said, "You see, Doctor, God provides," it wasn't pride in his voice. It was ownership. Hayes followed Josiah back down the staircase, but something inside him had shifted. The doctor entered the house as a man performing a duty. Now he moved like someone crossing through the ribs of a predator, aware he had seen too much, aware the walls themselves were listening. The silence throbbed. Every floorboard seemed to weigh his footsteps. And Josiah, walking calmly ahead, radiated the confidence of a man who believed the universe itself endorsed his authority. Outside, the light hit Hayes's eyes like a revelation. Even the open sky felt unnatural after the suffocating stillness inside. He walked toward his horse, but Josiah's voice stopped him with the force of a hammer striking cold iron. "You think you understand what you saw," the patriarch said, his tone gentler than a threat but sharper than a blade. He stood on the porch like a judge passing sentence. But men of the world, men educated by other men, lose sight of older truths. The air tightened around them. "God entrusted those girls to me," Josiah continued. "Not the courts, not the neighbors, not men like you." His gaze narrowed. "You saw 7 blessings, 7 lives unfolding exactly as the Almighty commanded. That is all you saw. That is all you need to carry with you." It wasn't a request. It was doctrine. Hayes felt something cold slide down his spine. Men like Josiah didn't threaten. They declared. They didn't persuade. They shaped reality and expected others to obey. The doctor nodded, hoping to diffuse the tension. But inside, he felt a growing storm, rage, disbelief, helplessness, and something darker, the realization that he was standing face to face with a perfectly engineered system of control. Not brute force, not chains, something far more effective: isolation, obedience, ideology. 3 tools that, when wielded patiently and without remorse, could trap any mind, even 7 at once. Hayes rode away with the sun sliding low behind him. In his journal that night, he wrote only one line about the ride home: "The land grows more silent behind me. It does not breathe until I am miles away." But silence was not escape. Because the moment he left the ranch, something began to gnaw at him, an instinct older than laws, older than medical training. Something every man feels when confronted with a truth he cannot unsee. If he walked away, no one else ever would come. And those 7 daughters would remain in that silent house, hidden from the world, under the command of a man who believed himself untouchable. For 3 nights, Hayes barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the room: 7 beds, 7 daughters, 7 lives folded into silence. He replayed every detail: the tightened shoulders, the lowered gazes, the way the youngest girl flinched when Josiah stepped too near. A physician can diagnose illness, but there is no manual for diagnosing terror. Yet that is exactly what he'd witnessed: terror disguised as obedience. On the 4th morning, Hayes made a choice that would alter the course of his life. He sought counsel, not from law, not from fellow physicians, but from a man who understood the human soul's capacity for both submission and resistance. Father Klaus Brandt, the Lutheran minister, a man who had seen enough suffering on 2 continents to recognize it without needing proof. Hayes arrived at the church before sunrise. The candlelight had barely thinned the darkness when he finished recounting the ordeal. Father Brandt listened silently, his weathered face tight with something beyond concern, recognition. In the old country, the priest murmured, a man with that level of control would be confronted immediately. But here, he gestured toward the vast Texas plains beyond the church window. Here, isolation is stronger than any tyranny Europe ever crafted. Distance becomes doctrine. Silence becomes scripture. But the law, Hayes began. The priest cut him off with a shake of his head. Law doesn't cross 30 miles of wilderness unless someone carries it on horseback. And those daughters cannot carry anything. Not even their own voices. The words struck Hayes harder than any reprimand. He felt the truth of them like a weight settling across his chest. He had glimpsed a system that consumed its victims from the inside out, a system so complete it didn't require chains, didn't require locked doors. Only distance, only obedience, only the slow erosion of a woman's belief that she had the right to be free. Still, the doctor pressed. Then what do we do? Father Brandt exhaled, choosing his words with care. You have a moral obligation. But the sheriff has a legal one, and he won't act without testimony. You need the daughters' voices. You need something undeniable. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping into a tone Hayes would later describe as the sound of a man trying to save another man's soul before it's too late. But understand this, doctor, once you challenge a man like Josiah, you step into a different kind of wilderness. One not found on any map. Hayes left the church with a burden heavier than before, yet clearer. He knew now that this wasn't just about medicine or law. It was about confronting a darkness crafted over years, sharpened by scripture, and shielded by land so empty it could swallow Christ whole. Hayes spent the next days moving through his routine like a man wading through mud, each step slow, heavy, distorted. His patients noticed the change, even if they couldn't name it. A rancher joked that he looked half-haunted, though Hayes didn't laugh. He couldn't. His mind kept drifting back to the ranch at the edge of the plains, to the silent daughters, to the patriarch whose control ran deeper than any illness Hayes had ever treated. But something unexpected began to gnaw at him: anger. Not fear, not helplessness. Anger, slow, simmering, coiling beneath his ribs like a living thing. Because he had seen injustice before, but never something so meticulously cultivated. Josiah hadn't built a home, he had built a world where he was the only law, the only source of truth. And the longer Hayes let the image of those girls settle in his memory, the more he realized something terrifying. He had become part of that world simply by witnessing it and doing nothing. The guilt became unbearable, so he decided to act, not recklessly, not blindly, but with purpose. His first step was subtle. He revisited families he trusted, asking careful questions about the dealings with Josiah. Most shrugged him off. Some grew uncomfortable. One rancher, after confirming no one else was within earshot, told Hayes a story he'd never forgotten, how Josiah had once ridden 12 miles in a thunderstorm just to punish a hired hand who'd shown disrespect. Another man admitted he hadn't seen the daughters in nearly a decade. A woman whispered, "The Lord hides what is wicked until he is ready to reveal it." Piece by piece, the truth formed a shape, a pattern, a history no one had dared articulate. And with each revelation, Hayes felt his resolve harden. He returned to Father Brandt, this time not seeking guidance but partnership. The minister listened, nodding slowly, knowingly. "If we're to help them," he said, "we must prepare for the storm that follows. Josiah will not surrender his dominion quietly." The plan they drafted wasn't heroic, it was cautious, imperfect, fragile. They would approach the sheriff together, with Hayes's medical authority and Brandt's moral weight. They would request a welfare check under the pretext of health concerns. Not an accusation, not yet, just enough to crack the shell of isolation. But as Hayes rode home from the church, he felt something shift in the air, something cold, something watchful. A presence on the horizon, as though Josiah, miles away, sensed the first tremor of defiance. The wilderness had been quiet too long. The sheriff's office was a squat, sun-bleached building at the edge of town, its porch sagging like an old man's shoulders. Hayes and Father Brandt arrived just after noon, the heat pressing down on them like a warning. Sheriff Lucas Hart sat behind his desk, boots crossed, chewing the end of a matchstick as though it were the only thing holding his patience together. When Hayes finished explaining, the sheriff didn't respond right away. He just stared at the doctor with a long, flat look, the kind a man gives when weighing not just words, but consequences. "You're asking me," Hart said finally, "to ride 30 miles into the middle of nowhere so I can question a man who's never broken a law in this county. And you want me to do it based on impressions, feelings." Father Brandt leaned forward. "Based on 7 young women who show signs of coercion, isolation, and fear." Hart shifted the matchstick. "Signs ain't evidence." Hayes felt the frustration climbing his throat, but he kept his voice level. "And what will it take for you to consider it? Injuries, a body, because by the time you get those, it'll be too late." The sheriff didn't flinch, but something flickered in his eyes. Not empathy, not agreement. Calculation. "Josiah Crane pays his taxes," Hart said. "Mind you, a lot of folks don't. And he doesn't cause trouble. Never has." Father Brandt's gaze darkened. "Men like Josiah don't cause trouble, Sheriff. They bury it." The room went still. Hart let out a slow breath and leaned back. "I'll ride out there, but I'm goin' to talk, not accuse. And if I find nothin' at all, this matter ends." It wasn't the victory Hayes wanted, but it was enough. Yet when he and Brandt stepped outside, a chill slid through Hayes's chest. Not from fear of Josiah, but from something far more unsettling. A ranch hand was waiting beside the hitching post, pretending to fiddle with his saddle cinch. Hayes recognized him, Jonah Pike, one of Josiah's occasional laborers. Quiet, nervous, too observant for his own comfort. Jonah didn't look at them directly. Instead, he spoke to the leather strap in his hands. "If you're plannin' to go to the Crane place," he murmured, "you best not go alone." Hayes exchanged a glance with Brandt. "Why?" the doctor asked. Jonah swallowed hard, his fingers trembling. "Because he already knows." A beat of silence. "I seen one of his boys ride out this mornin'," Jonah said. "Not toward town, toward the ridgeline. That's where the signal fires are." Father Brandt stiffened. Signal fires. Jonah finally looked at him, and the fear in his eyes was raw. Josiah don't wait for trouble to reach his door. He prepares for it. The horizon suddenly felt tighter, smaller, more dangerous. For the first time since visiting that ranch, Hayes understood the scale of what they were walking into. The sheriff set out early the next morning, though not alone. Hayes and Father Brandt rode with him, and Jonah Pike followed several lengths behind, as if unsure whether he belonged to courage or fear. Dawn had barely cracked the horizon, casting long blue shadows over the prairie. The air carried that uncanny stillness that sometimes precedes a storm, though not the weathering kind. The human kind. They rode in a loose formation, each man lost in his own thoughts. Hayes felt a knot tightening in his chest. He wasn't afraid for himself, he was afraid of what they might find. Afraid of what they might fail to find. Afraid of what silence might mean. After nearly 2 hours on the trail, the land began to change. Grass thinned, rocks jutted like broken teeth from the soil. The air tasted metallic, as though the land was holding its breath. That ridge up there, Jonah murmured from behind them, pointing. That's where he lights, uses smoke in daylight, fire at night. His boys, they know what it means. Hayes turned, troubled. How many boys does he have? Jonah hesitated. 2 blood sons, and 3 men who think they owe him their lives. Maybe more. The sheriff grunted. You telling me Crane built himself a damn militia? Jonah didn't answer. He didn't need to. As they crested a small rise, Hayes felt the air shift, subtle, but unmistakable. A presence, not supernatural, human, watchful, as if eyes were on him from somewhere unseen. The sheriff must have felt it too. He straightened in the saddle, hand brushing the butt of his revolver. Keep sharp, he muttered. The ranch appeared suddenly, unfolding in the distance, the wide porch, the clustered outbuildings, the windmill spinning lazily in the dry breeze. Everything was still, too still, as if the place were holding its breath, waiting. When they reached the yard, Josiah Crane was already standing on the porch, arms folded across his chest, posture carved from stone. He didn't greet them, he simply watched, eyes flat and measuring, like a man observing wolves trespass on his land. Sheriff Hart cleared his throat. Mornin', Josiah. Sheriff. Josiah's voice was calm, too calm. You brought company. I brought concern, Hart replied. Doctor here says he's got health questions about your daughters. Needed to follow up. Josiah stepped forward. My daughters are under the Lord's protection. Not yours. Hayes dismounted. They're under my medical care, Josiah. That gives me reason to check on them. A flicker crossed Josiah's eyes, displeasure, or warning. They're fine. We'll need to see them, Hayes said quietly. Silence descended, heavy, absolute. Then the door behind Josiah opened. One of the daughters stepped out. For a moment, Hayes didn't recognize her. Her face was different, swollen around one eye. Fading bruises crossed her cheekbone. Her hair was uncombed, hanging like a curtain she attempted to hide behind. Father Brandt inhaled sharply. The sheriff stiffened. Hayes felt his pulse spike, the world narrowing to a single point. Proof. Josiah stepped aside just enough to block the girl's path with his arm. She isn't receiving visitors today, he said. But it was too late. The lie was visible, the injury undeniable, the silence impossible to ignore. And behind the girl, Hayes saw motion, another daughter leaning in the doorway, face pale, eyes pleading, as if this moment was the first crack in a prison wall. Sheriff Hart lifted his chin. Josiah Crane, I'm going to need you to step aside. Josiah didn't move, didn't blink. Instead, he lifted 2 fingers to his shoulder, the smallest gesture. And somewhere out beyond the yard, a gun cocked, the sound of the gun snapping into readiness cut through the stillness like a jagged blade. Hayes froze, heart hammering, understanding instantly that Josiah Crane had planned for this. Every detail, every path, every approach, it had been calculated for decades. He had turned his isolation into an invisible fortification, one that no outsider could breach without consequence. And now, as the trigger clicked softly in the distance, Hayes felt the full weight of a predator who had spent years anticipating defiance. Sheriff Hart moved first, his hand on the revolver at his hip, but even he hesitated. Men of law are trained for confrontation, but confrontation against someone who has built his own domain, molded his daughters into silent witnesses, and mastered every inch of his land. That is a different challenge entirely. Hart's voice broke the tension. Step back, Crane. This doesn't have to get messy. Josiah didn't step back. He didn't flinch. His gaze, flat and merciless, measured each man like an object on a scale. Messy, he said softly, his voice carrying over the yard. This is obedience. You call it messy. I call it the way the world should be. Hayes swallowed, remembering every detail from that first visit, the symmetry, the silence, the young faces shaped into compliance by years of isolation. This was not a man defending a mistake. This was a man defending his reality, one that, if breached, could shatter all of them in an instant. From the doorway behind Josiah, another figure appeared. Naomi, her face pale and lips pressed tight, stepped onto the porch. She held herself with the same rigidity that Hayes had seen before, but her eyes flickered, not toward Josiah, but toward him. Recognition, a silent plea, and in that moment, Hayes realized the subtle rebellion had already begun. Small, fragile, hidden, but alive, Father Brandt exhaled, his hands tightening around his coat. We must negotiate, he muttered. No action without certainty. Hayes nodded, stepping slightly forward, voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. Josiah, I am not here to harm you. I am here because the girls deserve protection, guidance, and care. They are under my watch as a physician. That is all. Josiah's eyes narrowed. The threat was invisible, but real. The years of control, isolation, and fear had created a fortress, but Hayes could sense something shifting. The first cracks in a carefully constructed world rarely come from bullets or laws, they come from knowledge, recognition, and defiance that cannot be contained. From behind the porch, Sarah peeked, barely visible, trembling. The youngest, 15, her innocence had been stolen, her mind shaped by tyranny, yet in her glance was the spark of awareness, the first silent rebellion against her father's dominion. Hayes understood then what would be necessary. He would not simply challenge Josiah. He would have to dismantle the psychological prison he had built, one fragile fragment at a time. And to do that, he would need courage not just from himself, but from the daughters themselves. The game had begun, and there was no turning back. The moment stretched. The sun burned overhead, casting long, sharp shadows across the yard. Josiah Crane remained unmoving, a man carved from stone and conviction. But Hayes noticed the slightest tension in his jaw, a muscle twitching under control, subtle, almost imperceptible. Years of dominance had made him nearly untouchable, but even the strongest walls have fissures, and Hayes could sense the first fractures forming. He took a careful step forward, deliberately slow, his eyes never leaving Josiah's. The law will follow me if I report injuries, Hayes said. The girls' health, their futures, cannot be ignored. You've kept them isolated. That is not protection, it is imprisonment. You may call it obedience, but the world calls it harm. Josiah's gaze sharpened. And you think you know what is best for my family? His voice was calm, almost hypnotic, but heavy with authority. You do not. The world does not care for them. Only I care. Only God does. His posture was unwavering, but there was a subtle shift, his fingers flexed as though balancing patience against instinct. Hayes exhaled slowly. This was no ordinary negotiation. It was a psychological chess match where every word carried weight, and every hesitation could tip the balance toward catastrophe. Father Brandt shifted beside him, murmuring under his breath about the need for measured restraint, the dangers of a man who had molded minds over decades. Then, something remarkable happened. Naomi stepped forward, the eldest among the daughters visible now, her face pale but determined. She lifted her chin, her voice barely above a whisper, yet resolute. "They are right. We cannot stay silent." The words pierced the air like a bell tolling in a deserted city. 7 years of control, 7 daughters trained in absolute obedience, and yet one spark had ignited. Hayes felt a surge of cautious hope. The psychological grip Josiah had exercised for decades was not unbreakable. One small act of acknowledgement, one flicker of resistance, could start a chain reaction that even he could not fully control. But it would require precision, timing, strategy. Every step had to reinforce courage without triggering the full force of Josiah's wrath. The youngest, Sarah, stepped closer, hiding behind her sisters yet leaning toward recognition of something larger than fear. Hayes could see it in her eyes, a quiet understanding, a dawning awareness that the world extended beyond the walls of the porch, the fences, the isolation. That awareness alone was dangerous to Josiah, more dangerous than any law or weapon. Father Brand muttered, "The daughters must speak, but they must do so in a way that binds them to their own power, their own identity. Only then can the prison begin to crumble." Hayes nodded, feeling the enormity of the task ahead. He would not act alone. He would guide, mentor, awaken, not with force, but by slowly unmasking the control, the fear, the lie. And in that awakening, the daughters would find a voice powerful enough to shatter the carefully constructed silence. It was the first step. The descent into Josiah Crane's world had begun, and Hayes now realized, the real battle was not against him, but against the system he had imposed, the invisible chains forged over decades, stretching far beyond the boundaries of the ranch. The moment stretched. The sun burned overhead, casting long, sharp shadows across the yard. Josiah Crane remained unmoving, a man carved from stone and conviction. But Hayes noticed the slightest tension in his jaw, a muscle twitching under control, subtle, almost imperceptible. Years of dominance had made him nearly untouchable, but even the strongest walls have fissures, and Hayes could sense the first fractures forming. He took a careful step forward, deliberately slow, his eyes never leaving Josiah's. "The law will follow me if I report injuries," Hayes said. "The girls' health, their futures, cannot be ignored. You've kept them isolated. That is not protection, it is imprisonment. You may call it obedience, but the world calls it harm." Josiah's gaze sharpened. "And you think you know what is best for my family?" His voice was calm, almost hypnotic, but heavy with authority. "You do not. The world does not care for them. Only I care. Only God does." His posture was unwavering, but there was a subtle shift. His fingers flexed as though balancing patience against instinct. Hayes exhaled slowly. This was no ordinary negotiation. It was a psychological chess match where every word carried weight, and every hesitation could tip the balance toward catastrophe. Father Brand shifted beside him, murmuring under his breath about the need for measured restraint, the dangers of a man who had molded minds over decades. Then, something remarkable happened. Naomi stepped forward, the eldest among the daughters visible now, her face pale but determined. She lifted her chin, her voice barely above a whisper, yet resolute. "They are right. We cannot stay silent." The words pierced the air like a bell tolling in a deserted city. 7 years of control, 7 daughters trained in absolute obedience, and yet one spark had ignited. Hayes felt a surge of cautious hope. The psychological grip Josiah had exercised for decades was not unbreakable. One small act of acknowledgement, one flicker of resistance, could start a chain reaction that even he could not fully control. But it would require precision, timing, strategy. Every step had to reinforce courage without triggering the full force of Josiah's wrath. The youngest, Sarah, stepped closer, hiding behind her sisters yet leaning toward recognition of something larger than fear. Hayes could see it in her eyes, a quiet understanding, a dawning awareness that the world extended beyond the walls of the porch, the fences, the isolation. That awareness alone was dangerous to Josiah, more dangerous than any law or weapon. Father Brand muttered, "The daughters must speak, but they must do so in a way that binds them to their own power, their own identity. Only then can the prison begin to crumble." Hayes nodded, feeling the enormity of the task ahead. He would not act alone. He would guide, mentor, awaken, not with force, but by slowly unmasking the control, the fear, the lie. And in that awakening, the daughters would find a voice powerful enough to shatter the carefully constructed silence. It was the first step. The descent into Josiah Crane's world had begun, and Hayes now realized, the real battle was not against him, but against the system he had imposed, the invisible chains forged over decades, stretching far beyond the boundaries of the ranch. That night, Hayes could not sleep. The horizon outside Fredericksburg was a dark, unbroken line, but his mind replayed the day's confrontation like a series of echoing footsteps in a vast, empty hall. Josiah Crane had not moved. He had not spoken beyond his doctrine of obedience. Yet Hayes knew he had been tested, and the subtle shifts in the daughter's posture, the glances, had already begun to undermine years of control. Father Brand visited Hayes before dawn. The minister's expression was grave, lined with decades of witnessing human suffering. "You cannot force them," he said. "You can guide, you can awaken, but the awakening must come from within. Otherwise, Josiah will crush it before it ever leaves their minds." Hayes nodded, understanding that the path forward required patience, a kind of psychological precision as delicate and dangerous as surgery. He could not act as the law. He could not act as a savior. His role was subtler, yet infinitely more powerful, to plant the seed of awareness, to give the daughters language for their captivity, and to encourage the first flicker of defiance without provoking destruction. Days passed, each one a careful rehearsal of observation and small interaction. Hayes would visit the outskirts of the ranch, making casual inquiries while noting every expression, every tremor, every hesitation in the daughters' movements. He observed how they moved in synchronized patterns, how their eyes constantly measured where Josiah was, how they spoke only when permitted. It was a ballet of control, precise and brutal, perfected over decades. Then, one morning, Ruth spoke in the kitchen while Josiah tended the barn. Her voice was low, but unmistakable. "We are not invisible." The words startled Hayes more than any shout of panic could have. They were not a plea, they were a declaration, a spark in a room that had been dark for too long. He encouraged them carefully, framing questions not as challenges, but as truths waiting to be named. "What would it mean," he asked gently, "if you could speak without fear?" The girls hesitated, their faces masks of ingrained obedience. Yet behind the eyes, something shifted, a hesitation replaced by consideration, silence replaced by the stirrings of self-awareness. Hayes realized the magnitude of what he was seeing. Josiah's control was formidable, but it was not absolute. It relied on isolation, on fear, on the daughter's acceptance of imposed reality. Once that acceptance began to falter, even slightly, the power could be contested. He paused in his journal later that evening and wrote, "The first cracks appear not with violence, but with recognition." Once the daughters understand their own existence outside of his will, nothing can fully restore the fortress he has built. And now Hayes knew what must come next, a symbolic act, a phrase, a shared acknowledgement that would bind the daughters to their own identity and open the door to resistance. Without it, Josiah's tyranny would continue unchallenged, invisible and complete. At this point, he decided to teach them a phrase, a signal. And when the time came, he would ask them to repeat it twice. Twice, to seal their commitment, to claim their emerging power, and to awaken what had been long suppressed. The following morning, Hayes returned to the ranch before sunrise, riding silently through the mist that blanketed the Pedernales River Valley. Each step of his horse carried the weight of decisions decades in the making, each mile a reminder that he was entering a space not of law or morality, but of carefully constructed domination. The air was thick with tension, the kind that clings to skin and nerves like static. He dismounted quietly, adjusting his satchel and approaching the porch with measured steps. Josiah was already outside, standing like a sentinel, his eyes sweeping the horizon as if aware of every movement before it occurred. Hayes greeted him with calm formality, speaking not as an intruder but as a man carrying responsibility. "Josiah, I am here for the health and welfare of your daughters. I ask that you allow me a few moments inside." Josiah's lips pressed thin. "They are well," he said, "and under the Lord's care." Hayes nodded, undeterred. "I am a physician," he said evenly, "and it is my duty to ensure that well-being is real, not assumed." The patriarch's gaze lingered, sharp and unyielding. Then he gestured to the doorway. Ruth appeared first, her face pale but resolute. Naomi followed, then Judith, Esther, Deborah, Mary, and finally, Sarah, whose small frame trembled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Hayes felt the weight of every year of isolation pressing down on these girls, shaping their every posture, every glance. He spoke softly, deliberately, so that only they could hear. "There is a phrase," he said, "a phrase that carries power, that reminds you of who you are outside these walls. If you choose, you will speak it aloud. Twice, and with each repetition, you claim a part of yourself no one can take." The daughters exchanged subtle glances, hesitant but curious. Their bodies had been trained to obey, but their minds were beginning to stir. Ruth, the eldest, inhaled and repeated the phrase slowly, deliberately, her voice barely a whisper. Then Naomi followed, her tone firmer, as if each syllable unlocked something long suppressed. The others followed in sequence, their voices growing stronger, echoing faintly against the walls, until Sarah, the youngest, whispered it twice, the final repetition trembling but complete. Hayes felt a shift in the air, something imperceptible to outsiders, but undeniable to those who had been watching carefully. A psychological chain had been broken. Josiah stood rigid, his face unreadable, yet even he could sense the first cracks in the absolute obedience he had cultivated over decades. Father Brandt, standing slightly behind Hayes, murmured, "The first spark has been lit. The next steps will demand precision, courage, and patience. But it is begun." Hayes recorded in his journal, "Twice spoken, twice claimed. The daughters' voices are no longer property. They are the seed of awakening. This is the moment the fortress begins to fracture." The air in the Harrow, Crane, ranch shifted subtly after that morning. Hayes noticed it immediately. The daughters no longer moved in perfect synchrony. Their eyes flickered with curiosity, with unspoken questions. The silence that had once been a wall between them and the world was now punctuated by small, deliberate murmurs and glances exchanged when Josiah wasn't looking. Obedience, once absolute, had begun to fracture. That evening, Hayes and Father Brandt gathered at the edge of the property, speaking in hushed tones. "This is the first stage," Hayes said. "The phrase, repeated twice, is more than a signal. It's a claim of identity, a recognition of self. Once that is established, fear loses its edge." Father Brandt nodded slowly. "Fear can only maintain control when it is internalized. Once they know they can speak, even quietly, they begin to separate their own will from the tyranny that has defined them. That is dangerous to a man like Josiah. Dangerous, yes, but necessary." Hayes watched the daughters from a distance. They moved cautiously, brushing against each other in the kitchen, sharing small, seemingly inconsequential words. Yet every word, every look, carried weight. It was the first evidence that isolation alone could no longer dictate their perception of reality. They were beginning to anchor themselves in a world outside their father's dominion. Josiah remained unaware, calm, towering, confident. But Hayes could see it in the little things, a tightening of the jaw, a subtle flicker in the eyes, the way his hands brushed objects on the porch as though testing them for weakness. He had spent decades perfecting absolute control. But control depends on compliance, and compliance had just been disrupted. That night, Hayes wrote in his journal, "A fortress built of silence is the most vulnerable of all. Noise, even quiet noise, is a hammer. The daughters have begun to hammer. He traced the outline of the ranch in his notes, marking observation points, paths, and subtle escape routes. Every detail mattered. Every inch of territory could either protect them or betray them. Father Brandt placed a hand on Hayes's shoulder. "This is not a simple rescue," he said. "This is a battle for the mind. For years, he has crafted obedience as if it were a weapon. Now we begin to teach resistance. But remember, every step must be measured. One false move, and the structure snaps back into its old order, stronger and more punitive than before." Hayes nodded. He knew the danger intimately. He had seen the seeds of rebellion, and he understood that Josiah's response, once triggered, could be brutal. Yet the moment had arrived. The daughters had tasted the first flicker of autonomy, and nothing could fully erase it. The first stage was complete. Silence was no longer absolute. Observation, awareness, and recognition had begun to shift the balance. The next stage would require courage, timing, and strategy, because the fortress, though cracked, was still formidable. The following week, Hayes returned at dawn, the horizon streaked with pale light that did nothing to pierce the darkness still lingering in the ranch's corners. Josiah Crane appeared on the porch, arms crossed, eyes narrowing at the doctor's approach. His presence radiated control, the kind that had kept 7 daughters disciplined, compliant, and silent for years. But Hayes noticed the subtle shift. Josiah's eyes lingered longer on the girls, scanning for defiance, unaware that it had already begun. Hayes entered the house cautiously, noting how the daughters moved differently now. Their steps were not as rigid. The glances, once cast downward in practiced submission, now flicked toward him with something he could only call awareness. Ruth, the eldest, met his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than before, a spark of silent communication. Naomi lingered in the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the frame, as though testing her own autonomy. Even Sarah, the youngest, now held herself straighter, though her voice remained soft. Hayes spoke quietly, deliberately. "We've begun something here. It cannot be undone. Your voices are your own now. Do you understand?" Each daughter nodded, their movements small but deliberate, as if each gesture was a secret acknowledgement of the growing independence. Josiah's shadow fell across the room as he entered, catching the subtle changes immediately. His jaw tightened. "What is happening here?" he demanded. His voice was calm, but each word was a knife, honed and precise. Hayes stepped forward carefully, maintaining a calm tone. "You have raised your daughters under isolation and fear. That has given you control. But control is never absolute. Their minds are theirs. Their voices are theirs. You cannot take them back." Josiah's eyes flared. The daughters flinched subtly, yet none spoke. They had learned the power of quiet resistance. Hayes knew this was a pivotal moment. One word from the wrong person could ignite violence, but one calculated action could expand their freedom. Father Brandt's presence beside Hayes was quiet but commanding, a silent reminder that moral authority could counteract tyranny. The priest whispered to Hayes, "They must see their own power. Only then will the psychological prison begin to crumble completely." Hayes moved closer to the girls, guiding them with words that were more mentor than doctor. "Every small act of recognition, every whispered word, strengthens you. Repeat the phrase again, twice. This is not obedience to me. This is a claim over your own minds." One by one, the daughters repeated it, each utterance resonating, each repetition a tiny fracture in the walls of control. The air grew charged. Josiah's posture stiffened, his lips pressed in a hard line, yet even he could feel the shift, a current running under the surface, subtle but undeniable. Hayes stepped back, observing. The battle was psychological, invisible, and yet for the first time, Hayes sensed the scale of Josiah's vulnerability. The fortress, so carefully constructed over decades, had begun to crumble. By mid-morning, the ranch felt different. The silence that had long defined it now vibrated with unspoken tension. The daughters moved through their routines with a faint defiance that did not go unnoticed. Ruth carried water from the well with a steady rhythm, her eyes no longer fixed on the ground but scanning the horizon. Naomi cleaned the kitchen while glancing toward the windows, as if measuring what lay beyond. Each small gesture was a rebellion in miniature, imperceptible to anyone untrained to notice, but monumental to Hayes and Father Brandt. Josiah, meanwhile, remained on the porch, his posture rigid, his expression an unbroken mask. Yet subtle tells betrayed him, the tightening of fists, the brief flicker of irritation in his eyes, the sharp inhale that preceded his carefully measured words. He had ruled this domain for decades, yet the daughter's quiet acts of autonomy now challenged the very foundation of his authority. Hayes knew this well. Tyranny, when confronted not with force but with the assertion of self, begins to crack. Father Brandt leaned toward Hayes and whispered, "Observe the smallest details. Every hesitation, every glance, every unspoken communication is evidence of their awakening. We do not need a confession. We need recognition." Hayes nodded, understanding that they were now navigating the psychological battlefield of the mind. Josiah's dominion had always been absolute in appearance, but he relied on internalized fear, the daughter's belief that resistance was impossible. That belief was now being dismantled, one imperceptible action at a time. Hayes approached the girls quietly, keeping his voice low. "Remember the phrase, twice. Repeat it when you feel you are being watched. It is your shield, your claim, your declaration." One by one, they spoke, barely audible but distinct. Each repetition carried weight, a subtle assertion of self that made the air between them and Josiah tense and fragile. Even Sarah, the youngest, whispered it, her voice trembling but steady, the first step toward claiming a sense of agency she had been denied for 15 years. Hayes observed Josiah's response closely. The patriarch's eyes narrowed, his hands flexed as though feeling for the invisible cracks forming in his control. Hayes realized something critical. The battle was no longer external. Josiah could not fully control what he could not see. The daughter's internal awakening was invisible, uncontainable, and far more threatening than any outside interference. Their voices, once silenced by fear, were now instruments of liberation, and with each repetition of the phrase, the fortress of obedience he had built over decades weakened. Father Brandt placed a hand on Hayes's shoulder. "This is the turning point. Patience will be your ally, but vigilance must remain. Every day, every phrase, every whispered act strengthens them. And Josiah will feel it, even if he cannot name it." Hayes wrote in his journal that night, "The invisible chains are loosening. Their minds awaken before their bodies are free. This is how tyranny falls, from within." By mid-morning, the ranch felt different. The silence that had long defined it now vibrated with unspoken tension. The daughters moved through their routines with a faint defiance that did not go unnoticed. Ruth carried water from the well with a steady rhythm, her eyes no longer fixed on the ground but scanning the horizon. Naomi cleaned the kitchen while glancing toward the windows, as if measuring what lay beyond. Each small gesture was a rebellion in miniature, imperceptible to anyone untrained to notice, but monumental to Hayes and Father Brandt. Josiah, meanwhile, remained on the porch, his posture rigid, his expression an unbroken mask. Yet subtle tells betrayed him, the tightening of fists, the brief flicker of irritation in his eyes, the sharp inhale that preceded his carefully measured words. He had ruled this domain for decades, yet the daughter's quiet acts of autonomy now challenged the very foundation of his authority. Hayes knew this well. Tyranny, when confronted not with force but with the assertion of self, begins to crack. Father Brandt leaned toward Hayes and whispered, "Observe the smallest details. Every hesitation, every glance, every unspoken communication is evidence of their awakening. We do not need a confession. We need recognition." Hayes nodded, understanding that they were now navigating the psychological battlefield of the mind. Josiah's dominion had always been absolute in appearance, but he relied on internalized fear, the daughter's belief that resistance was impossible. That belief was now being dismantled, one imperceptible action at a time. Hayes approached the girls quietly, keeping his voice low. Remember the phrase, twice. Repeat it when you feel you are being watched. It is your shield, your claim, your declaration. One by one, they spoke, barely audible but distinct. Each repetition carried weight, a subtle assertion of self that made the air between them and Josiah tense and fragile. Even Sarah, the youngest, whispered it, her voice trembling but steady, the first step toward claiming a sense of agency she had been denied for 15 years. Hayes observed Josiah's response closely. The patriarch's eyes narrowed. His hands flexed as though feeling for the invisible cracks forming in his control. Hayes realized something critical. The battle was no longer external. Josiah could not fully control what he could not see. The daughter's internal awakening was invisible, uncontainable, and far more threatening than any outside interference. Their voices, once silenced by fear, were now instruments of liberation, and with each repetition of the phrase, the fortress of obedience he had built over decades weakened. Father Brandt placed a hand on Hayes's shoulder. This is the turning point. Patience will be your ally, but vigilance must remain. Every day, every phrase, every whispered act strengthens them. And Josiah will feel it, even if he cannot name it. Hayes wrote in his journal that night, the invisible chains are loosening. Their minds awaken before their bodies are free. This is how tyranny falls, from within. The days that followed were a delicate dance. Hayes arrived each morning before the sun fully rose, riding silently through the misted prairie, carrying nothing but his satchel, his voice, and the weight of knowledge few men would ever dare to wield. The daughters had begun to understand the power of subtlety, the strength in small gestures, and Hayes became both the guide and witness. He spoke quietly to them in corners, behind closed doors, teaching them how to claim their presence without provoking Josiah's wrath, how to assert a mind that had been conditioned for obedience. Ruth, the eldest, became the natural leader. Her gaze was steady, her voice measured. She repeated the phrase twice each morning, and then each evening, silently teaching her sisters the rhythm of self-possession. Naomi followed, speaking with a steadiness that belied the years of fear she had carried. The younger daughters, guided by observation and the subtle confidence of the elders, began to mirror these behaviors. Sarah, though the youngest and most fragile, repeated the phrase with a courage Hayes had not anticipated. Each utterance carried a symbolic weight, a quiet rebellion, a declaration that they were beginning to inhabit minds of their own. Josiah watched. He could sense the shift in atmosphere, though he could not pinpoint its origin. His control had depended on invisibility, on the daughter's unquestioning submission. Now, subtle acts, a glance, a breath held too long, a whispered repetition, threatened that carefully built empire. He felt it like a slow erosion beneath his feet, a current pulling at the very foundation of his authority. Hayes saw the tightening in Josiah's jaw, the flicker of irritation in his eyes, and the brief pause in his voice when he addressed the girls. The fortress was cracking, and it terrified him. Father Brandt remained a shadow in the room, a reminder that moral authority can rival physical dominion. Do not underestimate the value of quiet acts, the priest said. They are more dangerous to tyranny than confrontation. Fear, once shaken, cannot be fully restored. Hayes realized that their power was no longer contingent on secrecy alone, it now relied on awareness. Each daughter was awakening, slowly disentangling her mind from the prison Josiah had imposed. Every whispered repetition of the phrase was a hammer strike against decades of indoctrination. By evening, Hayes recorded in his journal, "The mind, once claimed, cannot be entirely reclaimed." Each repetition, each act of recognition, breaks the illusion of obedience. The daughters now own fragments of themselves that no force can take away. And in that awareness, a new danger emerged. Josiah would retaliate, more cunning, more insidious, sensing that his empire was under siege, but Hayes understood the truth, the internal awakening of the daughters could not be undone. Tyranny can survive many forms of resistance, but it cannot survive the reclamation of self. By the second week of Hayes' careful visits, the atmosphere within the Harrow, Crane, ranch had shifted irreversibly. The daughters carried themselves differently, a subtle defiance humming beneath the surface of their movements. Their heads were held slightly higher, their steps less mechanical, their eyes lingering on the horizon for moments too long to be mere accident. Even the smallest changes, the way Judith paused before answering, the tilt of Esther's chin when Josiah spoke, the almost imperceptible breath Sarah drew before repeating the phrase, was seismic in the silent war being waged inside these walls. Hayes observed them closely. Each gesture, each hesitation, each whispered repetition of the phrase was a claim, an act of self-possession that undermined decades of psychological domination. He could see the pattern forming. Once one daughter asserted herself, even in the smallest measure, the others mirrored her. Power, once taught and enforced as obedience, began to circulate in reverse, awakening, accumulating, spreading like wildfire through bodies long trained for silence. Josiah, meanwhile, was a storm contained behind a calm facade. He moved through the house with precision, checking rooms, scrutinizing the daughters' faces, measuring the atmosphere with the instincts of a predator who senses prey slipping from his control. Hayes could feel the tension in every line of his body, the rigid shoulders, the clenched fists, the eyes that darted like trapped birds. Control, Josiah realized, was no longer absolute. The invisible walls he had erected were crumbling from the inside, and the daughters were beginning to see the spaces between them. Father Brandt reminded Hayes of the delicate balance. Every act of awareness is fragile. One misstep, one challenge too overt, and the fortress can snap closed. They must learn to wield this awakening as a shield, not as a weapon, yet. Hayes nodded, understanding that the daughters' survival depended on strategy, patience, and timing. The phrase, spoken twice, had become a talisman of liberation, anchoring each girl to herself. It was not a rebellion they could shout into the world. It was a quiet, internal recognition of their own existence, their own power, their own claim to thought beyond obedience. In the evenings, Hayes recorded his observations, noting the smallest victories, a glance exchanged between Naomi and Ruth, a breath held before answering Josiah, Sarah's hesitant but deliberate repetition of the phrase, the unspoken communication flowing through the eldest guiding the youngest. Each moment accumulated, a psychological erosion of control built over decades. He wrote, "Obedience is a prison constructed of silence and fear. Once recognition seeps in, once the mind claims itself, the prison becomes a labyrinth of cracks through which freedom can move." The daughters now carry keys forged from awareness itself. Tyranny cannot endure when the mind has been awakened. As summer deepened, the tension inside the Harrow ranch reached a new intensity. The daughters' small acts of autonomy became more frequent, though still carefully concealed beneath the guise of compliance. Ruth carried water and wood with a quiet strength, her movements precise yet undeniably hers. Naomi spoke softly to Esther in the kitchen, words masked as casual conversation but weighted with strategy and understanding. Judith began to read, something forbidden in the house for years, absorbing knowledge and insight from books Hayes had discreetly provided. Every small act chipped away at the foundation of Josiah's control, though he remained vigilant, sensing the shifts without fully comprehending their source. Josiah's methods of enforcement grew more subtle, more insidious. He began to test them, posing questions that seemed innocent, observing reactions, noting the smallest deviations from perfect obedience. Yet Hayes and Father Brandt knew these tests were cracks in themselves. The daughters, armed with the symbolic phrase repeated twice, had begun to recognize their own minds as separate entities. Even when Josiah demanded submission, they could shield their awareness, preserving internal freedom even while outwardly obeying. Hayes watched Sarah closely. The youngest had always been the most fragile, yet now she exhibited a quiet courage. When Josiah entered the room unexpectedly, Sarah froze, but only momentarily. Then she remembered the phrase, whispered it twice under her breath, and exhaled, steadying herself. It was a small victory, almost invisible, yet monumental. In that fleeting moment, the invisible chains tightened by decades of fear and isolation were loosening. Father Brand leaned in, voice low but firm. These small victories are more dangerous than confrontation. They are seeds. Tyranny depends on submission, and once the mind begins to claim itself, no amount of intimidation can fully reclaim it. You must nurture these seeds carefully, without exposing them to Josiah's suspicion. Hayes nodded, understanding that the battle was no longer simply medical or moral, it was psychological, a war fought in the space between obedience and awareness. Each repetition of the phrase, each subtle act of recognition, was an assertion of identity, a reclamation of the self. The daughters were learning to inhabit a mental space beyond their father's reach. That night, Hayes recorded in his journal, "Power is a fragile construct, maintained by fear and silence. Once recognition enters, obedience fractures." The daughters now carry fragments of themselves that even Josiah cannot erase. The fortress may still stand, but the stones are loose. And once loosened, no wall of tyranny can withstand the force of awakened minds. The next phase was clear: the daughters must begin to understand their strength collectively, to see that each act of internal freedom reinforced the others, creating a lattice of resistance Josiah could neither predict nor destroy. Hayes knew the endgame would be psychological as much as physical, and the awakening, once begun, could not be stopped. By late summer, the ranch was a tense theater of unseen battles. Josiah remained outwardly dominant, but the daughters' internal defiance had grown into a quiet, collective intelligence. They communicated in gestures, glances, and small shared actions, a language forged in fear but now repurposed for survival. Hayes observed the evolution with a mixture of caution and awe. Every whispered repetition of the phrase, every carefully measured pause, every silent assertion of autonomy was a strategic strike against decades of tyranny. Ruth emerged as the natural anchor, guiding her sisters with subtle authority. Naomi mirrored her movements. Esther began to organize small routines that allowed them to care for themselves independently, and even Sarah, though the youngest, had begun to make small, deliberate decisions without immediate approval. These acts were invisible to Josiah, who remained absorbed in maintaining the illusion of control. But Hayes knew better: the psychological prison, once breached, becomes impossible to fully enforce. Josiah, sensing the cracks, escalated his surveillance. He would enter rooms unannounced, question the girls with precision, and demand adherence to long-established routines. Yet even his most careful tactics failed to reassert the absolute control he had known. The daughters had discovered a crucial truth: obedience can be performed outwardly while independence thrives inwardly. The phrase, repeated twice, had become their mental shield, their anchor to a self beyond his grasp. Father Brandt reminded Hayes of the stakes. "You are guiding minds that have been conditioned for fear. One misstep, one overt challenge, and the collapse could be catastrophic. Yet without risk, there is no awakening. They must understand their strength collectively, the network of consciousness that binds them beyond his power." Hayes began to train the daughters further, not through direct confrontation, but through strategic exercises in awareness and silent defiance. He guided them to recognize each other's cues, to support and reinforce the inner autonomy of the group, to cultivate resilience in the face of Josiah's intimidation. Each session was measured, each word calculated, each act designed to fortify their internal power. By the end of the day, Hayes wrote in his journal, "The fortress is no longer unbreachable. The daughters' minds are awake, interlinked, and growing in strength. Tyranny depends on fear and isolation, both are being eroded. Josiah may command their bodies, but he cannot command their minds. The psychological war has shifted, and we are winning, quietly, invisibly, but decisively." Hayes understood the final stage would not be physical. It would be subtle, relentless, and psychological, a dismantling of control from the inside, a reclamation of self that, once fully realized, could never be undone. The daughters were awakening, and once awakened, nothing could restore the silence that had once bound them. The final stage of their awakening began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Hayes returned to the ranch at dawn, riding through the mist-laden prairie, aware that this day marked a shift that could never be reversed. The daughters were no longer simply followers. They were becoming architects of their own minds. Each had internalized the phrase, repeated it twice, and transformed it into a shield against the authority that had defined their lives for so long. They had begun to understand the contours of their own power, and with that understanding came a new, dangerous clarity. Josiah remained a towering figure of intimidation, but even he could sense the subtle erosion of absolute control. His eyes scanned the rooms, measuring every gesture, every hesitation, every glance. Yet the daughters moved with purpose now, no longer merely reacting, but operating in a coordinated awareness that he could neither predict nor suppress. Ruth guided the eldest acts, Naomi facilitated communication, Esther organized routines, Judith measured timing, Deborah and Mary supported the younger ones, and Sarah, at 15, had learned to assert herself in small but significant ways. Hayes watched, silently calculating each psychological shift, noting the cracks in the fortress of obedience that Josiah had spent decades constructing. Father Brandt, ever present, whispered, "Observe how awareness compounds itself. Each act of recognition strengthens the others. Fear is still present, but it no longer dominates. Tyranny depends on isolation. You have undone it. But remember, the danger is now acute. The patriarch will sense it, and his retaliation may be swift, precise, and brutal." Hayes guided the daughters in exercises of subtle coordination, gestures, timing, silent communication, teaching them to claim their own space even while under observation. Each whispered repetition of the phrase reinforced their internal sovereignty. Their minds, once completely claimed by obedience, now operated as a collective network, fortified against fear. As night fell, Hayes wrote in his journal, "Control, when built on silence and fear, cannot withstand recognition. They have learned that the mind cannot be enslaved when it knows itself. Josiah may command their bodies, but the consciousness within is untouchable. They are awake, they are free within themselves. And in this freedom, tyranny is powerless." The daughters, now aware of their own agency and the strength of the shared consciousness, had reached a threshold that could never be reversed. Hayes understood, in that dark, quiet room, that the psychological liberation they had achieved was more potent than any law, more enduring than any punishment. The fortress had fallen, not with force, but with recognition. Silence had been broken, fear displaced, and the daughters' minds were theirs alone. They had emerged from decades of control, forged by awareness, and nothing, no authority, no intimidation, could take that away. The awakening was complete. Tyranny had met its match in the human mind, and the daughters, once prisoners of circumstance and fear, now carried a freedom that no one could revoke.